All right, hello and welcome back to the Gumtree of Liberty podcast. I'm your host, LibertyDownUnder, and with me today I've got my co-host, CentristOzzy, and welcoming back to the show, we've got Gerrie and Jack from the last two live streams who are joining the Gumtree of Liberty as permanent co-hosts as well. And so today what we thought we'd do is we'd break down the Australian political parties, the major ones, and some of the minor ones as well, and what they claim to stand for and what during COVID they actually have stood for. So the parties we're going to discuss today are the Liberal National Party, which is a coalition of the Liberals and Nationals, which is basically one party. You've got Labor Party, Greens. They're probably the three biggest ones. Then we've got One Nation, Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, and finally the Liberal Democrats or LibDems. So I thought what we'd do is we'd go down in order of size. So start with the LNP and break down what they stand for, in theory at least.
Yeah.
Because what we've seen during COVID is they don't really stand for that at all, really. But I think it's the same for every party. That what they claim to stand for, they haven't done in practice.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry?
We should also mention that the states and federal are not totally in line as well with their parties. So
there are factions.
Yeah.
Which is why we see leadership spills so often. We should also probably mention that the fact that we don't actually directly vote for representatives, it's all rank choice. So
yes. Yeah.
We've never actually directly and we actually elect a leader. We elect a party and the party assigns a leader. So we've technically never actually voted for a leader. So that's fun.
So it's the same approach.
Sorry, but I was on that point with it Jack said, which causes all the confusion in the public because they actually perceive that they do.
Yes.
And it's been a bone of contention for years.
Yeah, that's why sorry, mate. I was just going to add in there. That's why we went through so many prime ministers in such a short little time a while back, and was the laughing stock of the rest of the world.
Again.
Five last decade.
Oh, I don't know. It was just insane. I lost all faith in politics.
Kevin Rudd.
It's only just come back to it.
So what? Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Rudd again.
Yep.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison.
And then Scott Morrison. And then we're probably going to see another one if he doesn't pull his shit together.
So I might quickly just do a breakdown of just how voting works for federal and for state governments in Australia, except Tasmania, because they've got a bit of a different electoral system to everywhere else. But how it basically works is we've got the House of Reps, which federally is 151 members. You vote for the member of your federal electorate, and then they become the MP. And then the party that has the most MPs in the lower house and if that party has over half, so 76, I think it is 76 MPs, you get to become your party leader becomes prime minister because you have the majority in the lower house. If it's a coalition, so under Julia Gillard's government, they were a minority government, so Labor did not have enough seats. They didn't have 76 seats. They needed to do a coalition with the one Greens MP and several independent MPs, which are called the crossbench. So that's what those minor parties and independents are called, the crossbench. I had to work with the crossbench to pass legislation. That was the first time in 40 years that we've had that, but it's been very divisive in terms of politics in the last decade or so. We've had lots of coalitions forming in different factions and party leadership spills and that sort of stuff. And then in the Senate, it's a certain number of senators per state. It's 12 per state. And then the Northern Territory and Australian Capital Territory get 2 each because they're not states, they're territories. So that's and then it's, I think, 76 seats in the Senate. You don't need a majority in the Senate to form government, just a majority in the lower house. So often you'll see coalitions forming in the Senate because it's all proportionate, and because there's 12 senators per state. There are currently, I think it's 9 Green senators compared to 1 Greens MP.
That's unfortunate.
Because of how voting works, because we have preference voting, it's a lot easier for minor parties to get voted into the upper house than it is for them to get voted into the lower house, which is why there are so many more minor parties in the upper house, and they control the balance of power right now. There are enough on the crossbench to mean that the LNP does not have a majority there, so they've got to work with crossbenchers, normally one nation, to pass legislation in the upper house. The upper house speaker or the president can vote, and the lower house speaker, who is from the largest party, can't vote unless they break a tie. That's just a very brief rundown of how the elections work in every state but Tasmania, which is a bit of a different system. And none of us are Tasmanians, so we don't really know how that works either. And except in Queensland, where we just have one house, the lower house. So we probably start with the LNP, given that they're the party in charge right now. Run down some of their big policies. So they claim to be pro small business. They tend to be pro small government, which in practice has usually meant 1% smaller than what Labor wants. In the same way as the Republicans want 1% lesser government than Democrats want in America. And basically every conservative party throughout the world, they're not really pro small government when they're in power, but when they aren't,
they're not really conservative either.
No. So they're definitely to the left of say the GOP, for example, in America. They're pro welfare state, pro public health care, definitely pro gun control. Our gun control laws, the 1996-97 gun buyback, was done by John Howard, probably the most important LNP member and Prime Minister for the last 30-odd years. He was in power for, 10 years? 96 to 2007?
12, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 12 years, just short of Menzies. See, and 1996 is an interesting year too, where they seized the guns. But Howard also is responsible for bringing in, some of the biggest welfare spending. It was when they brought in baby bonuses, because my children were young around that. It was one of the worst things they could have ever done. I would still to this day do not support it. I actually never supported it when it happened because it was so opposite of everything the Liberal Party stood for. So, yeah, that was one of the biggest standouts for us.
Labor did the same thing a few years later too, didn't they?
Well, it was already in. It was enshrined then. It was part of it. But Howard brought it in, which was really quite shocking.
And similarly, Labor tends to be seen as more economic. I guess we can discuss Labor and Liberal at the same time and compare and contrast their policies. Labor is more economic. They're more economic left in theory. In practice, the Bob Hawke and Paul Keating governments were, which was around 20 years they were in power together. Paul Keating was Bob Hawke's treasurer. To do the budget, that sort of stuff, was doing the budgets every year, presented those. They really, really brought in free markets or at least some form of free markets into Australia. The LNP was a lot more protectionist. The Australia was very protectionist until the 1960s, where we did have some changes under the LNP prime ministers of the early and mid 1960s. But it didn't really come into force until the Hawke and Keating era, which is the 1980s and early and mid 1990s as well. So
and they also brought in the welfare state as well. So
both sides are pro welfare state, as Gerrie.
Yeah, but Labor were the ones that introduced it. Labor were the ones to introduce it initially. Was it Whitlam? I think. Was he the one that brought in the welfare state?
I think you are. I think you are correct there. Yeah.
Right. Well, Whitlam was all very much, the free education, and mind you, I do have some sort of mixed views on free education too. That's the thing. You're not wholeheartedly 100% on an ideology. There are things you can deviate from. But anyway, he did. But the biggest shock, I think, was when it ramped up from Howard. That was really remarkable.
Because Malcolm Fraser, who was the LNP leader in the 1970s between Whitlam and Hawke, as well as Hawke and Keating and Fraser, weren't massive supporters of the welfare state to the extent that Whitlam and Howard were. So it did remain around the same size. Didn't increase. Didn't really shrink either because it was quite popular. But yeah, it didn't really see a massive increase as far as I know until the Howard era. Or what do I know? I'm that young. I didn't live through that anyway. But still, that's just the way I see it.
So is it safe to say that economically both Liberal and Labor are pretty much around the centre? They flip and flop between the two?
Yes, I'd say Labor is. I'd say Labor is central. In theory, Labor is centre-left and Liberals are centre-right, but not always in practice.
In reality, they're both in the right top quadrant, if we're using the political compass.
Oh, no, economically, they're a lot more when it comes to social progressiveness and authoritarianism, they're both the top half of the compass. Economically, they probably are. I'd say Liberals are probably about centrist right now, and Labor's shifted a bit more further to the left. I wouldn't say they're the top right quadrant because neither of them are really supportive of any form of free markets right now. They're both really shutting down any small business and fining businesses that choose to open and let in people who don't have the vaccine. So
I would argue they're slipping towards the very top.
Yeah.
They really are slipping. Definitely moving towards the top. They're definitely moving away from this idea of individual liberty. I would almost caution to say that they're both slipping towards the left as well. Centralized government, centralized control, controlled markets, that sort of stuff. Police state.
That's why I'm saying that's why I'm saying they're not top right. They're probably top left.
Top left, I would say that too. I mean, just while we're on it, this is the most hypocritical statement on the Liberal Party, the Federal Liberal Party side, is that they talk about these inalienable rights and freedoms of all people. But this sentence, in those most basic freedoms of parliamentary democracy, the freedom of thought, worship, speech, and association. Now, let's look at that in today's world. They could not be further from that.
Yeah, spot on. And I'm pretty sure that if we pull up the Labor's page, they would have a similar blanket statement, and they also are deviating away from it.
Well, there's more collectivism. It's a collectivist mindset.
I've got the Labor policies up now. I'll pull those up on screen. We can go through those if we want.
Sounds good.
All right. So these are the policies of Labor that should be coming up on screen now. There we go. A bit slow today. The internet here has not been good. It's been down for a lot of today. Hopefully it holds up. So yeah, obviously, definitely, like in terms of like looking at their policies right now, and there's just a few of them. You've definitely you got obviously the big one that stands out for me is criminalize wage theft, which is often it sounds good in theory, but in practice,
is that criminalizing tax?
No. Penalizing businesses for bad economic choices. It sounds good in theory. In practice, it often comes out into quite controlling what employers can and can't do. Yeah. Whereas us as libertarians tend to prefer that being worked out between employer and employee instead of being done by the government. It tends to work out a lot fairer for both parties if it's done by the companies themselves in negotiated contracts. Labor's definitely also more. They
say here that they're going to discount electric cars, but Labor is in Victoria, and to buy a Tesla Model 3, right, the cheapest one that's meant to be about $40,000, it costs about $80,000 because of a luxury car tax. So I don't know what they're saying about this or whether the national and the state level is different, but there is definitely no discount on electric cars in Victoria. I don't know about any other state, but they're definitely not in Victoria.
I think you're right with that. That they, again, it's the whole idea that they have these grand policies to appeal to the left, making sure that they get the voters that instead of the Greens. So trying to piggyback on Greens policies, so Greens, I'd say, are a lot more left-wing than Labor are. So they're trying to appeal to Green voters to win them over instead of having them go to the Greens, which means that Labor will get more voters, and then of course Labor will get into power because already they have the preference deal between Labor and Greens. So for those who don't know, it's in Australia because we have the ranked voting system. You rank them. Usually it's 1 to 6, 1 to 5, depending on how many people are in your electorate. And then Senate ballot paper. I don't know how many people you put on it.
Yeah.
On the Senate ballot paper, how many do you put there?
I think you can. It's like 1 to 9 above the line, or you can do like all of them below.
Yes, because of that ranked voting system, preference voting. Usually, Labor will ask their voters to vote Greens second, and Greens voters will ask their voters to put Labor second. It's
put the Liberals last.
It's an unofficial.
It's called it's basically a more decentralized version of the LNP at this point. Honestly,
Can I
they don't always put each other last. Pauline Hanson, they will always squeeze her out. The last election, I believe, they both agreed to put One Nation.
When you say both agreed, you mean the parties. You can't force people to vote a certain way. That's just the party's official stance.
Yeah, that's just the how to vote card. Yeah, that's the way that they try to tell people how to vote. But they don't always. They can work together. They have done it before where they do it to One Nation in the last election where she looked like she was going to make an impact. So they will work to...
Very Pauline Hanson.
One Nation. I'm just thinking where it was the federal one or the state election. I think it might have been the one in Queensland.
I think that was the Queensland election.
They do it, yeah, it's Queensland, and they do it in various seats. It's not uniform. Depends on where. Yeah.
Federally.
Sorry. Go.
You go.
I was going to say before we moved on, but you finish off what you were saying.
Federally speaking, Labor and Greens are a lot closer than they are at the state level. In the most recent Queensland election, which was November last year. I'm pretty sure, you correct me if I'm wrong there, Gerrie. I think it was November last year.
Not last year, the year before. Yeah, no, not 2020.
November 2020. No, it was 2020, wasn't it?
No,
last year.
The one before.
No, I'm talking about the last election where Palaszczuk got in with the swing towards her. Because I know the Greens picked up seats then. Yeah, the Greens picked up seats from Labor because at a state level, Greens and Labor will fight each other more than they will at a federal level. So Greens won seats from Labor in the last Queensland election, whereas federally, obviously they work together at least in the lower house. In the Senate, it's more competitive because you can have multiple senators from each party in a state. That at a federal level, they tend to be a lot more supportive one another as opposed to being competitive, which they definitely are in some states. Not all states, but definitely in states where they have the majority. So in Queensland, which usually votes Labor at a state level and LNP at a federal level because of gerrymandering, Labor and Greens can afford to fight more at a state level because they already know they're going to have the majority anyway. And even with the Greens and Labor fighting one another this election and Greens picking up a seat, Labor still had a swing towards them, still picked up a few seats from the LNP. So that they know they can fight it out at a state level because they know they're going to win anyway. So it's no loss to Labor. So they're happy to fight out with the Greens then. If it was a lot more on a knife's edge, they'd probably work together more because they know they need to make sure that the Liberals don't have control. What were you going to say before? Sorry, centrist?
Do you mind bringing up the policies again? I just want to point something out that I picked up on the other day. And when we're talking about where a political party sits on the spectrum and where they're moving to, the other week, a bill got voted down by the Liberals, which was about women's safety in the workforce. So if you scroll down to Labor's policy, so I think it's a bit further down. Was it there or is it at the start? Or maybe it's up.
What are you looking for?
Keep going. Women's safety, there it is. So what they've done, I read this bill because for me, it didn't make a lot of sense that even the Liberals would vote this thing down, unless there was a reason for it. So I looked it up and I read the bill, and what was put through in the bill seemed pretty solid, except for the fact that there was a couple of lines in there where they said that all the data, like something to do with data and information collected, will be looked through an intersectionality lens. So while we're talking here and saying that Labor and Greens are sort of centre-left, moving left, that statement there in that particular bill they tried to put forward is obviously an indication that they're moving further and further to the left.
At least socially, you mean?
Yeah,
more socially progressive. Was that federal or state level?
Yeah, that was a federal bill that got voted down. I know because a lot of the people I know who are on the left were outraged because it sounds terrible. You voted down women's safety in the workforce. What the hell are you doing? But unless you go and read the bill and you pick out those particular lines, there's a lot about intersectionality and those sort of principles inside of that bill, which would then, like, for me, I probably agreed with like 9 out of 10 points. But once that intersectionality thing come in, you could see that it's moving towards a path that I don't think we should be heading down. I don't think intersectionality belongs in a democracy. It should be meritocracy as well. And yeah, it was just interesting that they put that sort of framing and language into that bill. That's all.
Well, see, because we have mandatory voting in Australia, people are a lot more apathetic and less interested because it's just a job to do. There's no real interest in politics. It's just, you rock up on a Saturday, get a sausage sizzle, snag on bread, then go do your vote, and then you're done. Whereas like in other countries where it's voluntary, it's people are a lot more involved in it. But because in Australia they know people, will just like read the names of the bills and that's it. They can put that stuff in there down the bottom or in the fine print and get away with it. Obviously, you've got the most recent example probably is definitely that bill or the domestic violence and sexual domestic violence inquiry, which recommendation 33, I think of that one, was to say you need to use 100 points of ID to use social media. So that's like show your driver's license and your birth certificate or passport or something like that. So use social media and give the police more access to people's accounts. That was in a bill for domestic violence.
This is becoming a joke across all political spectrums everywhere in the world at the moment. Like, they are doing this everywhere, and it's really it's really starting to mount a defense against democracy isn't worth agreement with democracy isn't working, because at the moment politicians around the world are taking advantage of it and they're sliding stuff into bills that have nothing to do with it in order to try and get their agenda across, which is not the way it should be done, and that's not the way democracy is supposed to be set up. It's really worrying, because it's not just happening here, and this is not just an attack at Labor. This is something the Liberals do as well. In America, they do all the same thing. They do bills that are massive, and then no one ever reads them, and they vote them in. So it's all this stuff that gets getting switched.
Well, there's a famous clip by Pelosi where she said you have to read once you pass the bill, then you can read what's in it. I think I'm misquoting her, but there's that famous clip with her saying, well, we have to pass the bill so you can read it.
Yes, I heard about something that too. A little while ago, she did say that. It's the same with that big defence bill that they passed last year. That had
the $3.5 trillion one, or the one last year?
The one that we were talking about before, although they made that amendment to it for it. It's read as.
Are you talking about? Is that the enhancement of defence response to emergencies bill?
Yes. Yes. Defence legislation response to emergencies. Yes. There's that one. That was a massive bill, huge. I don't know how many hundreds of pages. And what was the other one? When Centrist was just talking, there was another one.
Biosecurity.
Yeah, the biosecurity as well.
Or the Identify and Disrupt bill.
Yeah, that too. There was another one that came. I'll think about it. There was another bill as well that.
But like this kind of proves what we're talking about. With most people don't you could say those names of those bills to people and they have no idea what you're talking about. The only reason we know about it is because we're looking for it actively at the moment. Like, you could ask me 2 years ago about these bills and I wouldn't have had any clue. So
People gloss over it. People don't want to talk about politics. I know that's it. Don't talk to me about politics. It has no bearing on my life. That's what I get.
So for example, when we had the same-sex marriage plebiscite of 2017, which was interestingly voluntary as opposed to basically every other vote we've done for the last 100 years, that was basically a nationwide. I called it a nationwide opinion poll, basically, to tell the government how to vote because they were too cowardly.
What I don't understand is why the government can't just be like, legal, because who cares what the people say? It's about rights. It's a protection of rights, right? It's ensuring the ability of someone to be able to live without government interference or the interference of other people. So I don't think people would have really cared if they were just like, inside another bill, slip that in, because really, who cares? Like, what right does someone have to have a say over someone else's personal life?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it was just a massive waste of money, and I think it was it was more or less done so it was a save face for Malcolm Turnbull,
who was LNP.
Yes, it was more of a save face from him because he was in support of it but didn't want to say it because it would lose his base. Yeah, that's all it was.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was saying. That's why it was important to have the referendum on it, because then they could blame. So what sorry, not blame, that's probably not the right term. What Turnbull could then say is, well, look, this is what the people want. That's why we're pushing this through. So that's why they went to referendum. Because if he had done it and lost his base, there goes any chance at the election.
And then he got replaced.
It was a plebiscite because it wasn't mandatory referendums for the Constitution. But my point with bringing it up. The reason why I brought it up is because it's such an important issue to a lot of people, and because it was compulsory and not compulsory, it was voluntary voting. You had massive campaigns, and you still only saw a high 70s to early 80 to low 80% turnouts. So I think it was
was it? I didn't think it was that high. 60%.
Most electorates that I saw, it was around 76 to 83. I have a graph somewhere I can pull up after this, but I'm pretty sure it was around that much. And it was an important issue to most people, and it was a massive campaign for it. And you still only had 70, 80% of people turn out for it. So it's like
there were so many people in Melbourne when the vote was happening, when they were marching. There was so many people.
That just proves my point that most Australians are apathetic about politics, because it took a massive campaign and to get people to vote, to get that many people to vote for such.
But that's the biggest problem about Australia. They're apathetic, but they are forced to vote. So they vote for how they're told to vote, not what they want to vote for, because they don't care.
That's that point. People don't read what the parties stand for, or read the bills they're passing and the sort of stuff, or even read the explanatory memorandums of bills to work out what they're actually about.
Yeah. Because they're only self-interested.
People don't care.
People only think, what's in it for me? That's it. What's in it for me?
No, that's exactly right. I linked these two things, which are they're both the major parties talking about the wage gap. I think we should talk about this because they're both parroting the same stuff basically, which is kind of interesting.
All right, give me 1 second to. I've got the Labor one up right now. Give me 1 second to share it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's the Labor one up there. Should be up there now. There we go. It's loading. So that's the Labor one. So I'll just zoom in on those points.
I just want to say that this is all. It's not actually a pay gap. It's an earnings gap. It's actually based on everything. It's based on time worked, full-time work, part-time work, casual work, overtime, all of this stuff. It also doesn't account for any of this. It's a general men versus women, which is why it is a gap. It's not actually what they say, and it's very misleading. And I just wanted to bring this up because it is something that both parties parrot. Both parties parrot the Workplace Gender Equality Agency on this thing, which, if you actually look at their methodology, isn't actually a wage gap, because it comes down to a bunch of things like negotiations. Because if you go to a company and you get offered a salary and it's the same salary, McDonald's, for example, where girls aren't going to get paid more than boys. It's just not going to be a thing. It's when you get to the higher levels, when you get to specialized work, a lot of women go into nursing, education, caregiving roles, and a lot of men go into STEM and a bunch of that stuff. When I was doing my engineering degree, there was one chick in the class.
Before we go
all of my classes.
Just on that point.
Sorry, you go.
So we keep doing this. You go.
Okay. So what I want to point out is, in that particular instant, the issue you're having is not is the fact that we're getting dirty data, which is something I've been saying about the COVID at the moment as well, is that we're not getting clean data and we're presented with something happening that doesn't necessarily reflect accurately. So if you broke all those things down and showed everyone where these discrepancies are happening, I think you'll find most people will agree that if something is happening and it's based on gender, then we don't want to stomp that out. We believe in equality. But we also don't want to see dirty data being used for dirty politicians in order to.
So, like, if So if you go down to the bottom of the page, there's a bit here that says what data will be made public, right? So basically, they're pretty much mandating the fact that companies will have to release the wages of its workers, which I am not very happy about. I don't like that. That's Labor. Liberal is less so, but
I've just read the Liberal one. I wanted to share that one because I found a really interesting sentence on that, on their policy, which I think really shows how similar these two parties are on some issues. To pull that one up, just that one sentence there, the gender pay gap was also moving in the right direction, down to a record level of 13.9%. From 17.4% under the previous Labor government. So basically, the LNP is saying we're better on the gender wage gap than the left are. which like, if you're a socially conservative party, this should not be high on your
because it's
radar.
Politics. This is playing politics. That's all it is.
And especially when the party is meant to be a right-wing free market party. The controlling and adjusting for what is market competition in wages is not what your party should represent.
People are saying that the Melbourne tradie protest, which happening as we record this week, people say they're paid LNP members going out there or they're neo-Nazis and far-right extremists, and I'm like, which far-right extremists and neo-Nazis in the history of the world have supported
for the workers
the pay gap? Tell me which Nazi or fascist party supported shrinking the gender wage gap? just answer the question for me, please. Read their policies and read what they've done, and then come back to me and say they're neo-Nazis and give me.
Well, that came straight from the mouth of the CFMEU bosses. That lie was spread by the CFMEU bosses, parroted by the ACTU secretary and Bill Shorten. So, I mean, that sort of tells you where they stand. That these people meant to be on the left side of politics, are trying to label their workers as far-right extremists. Now, if I were you and I were running the Labor Party, I tell you what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't call my base neo-Nazis. That's what I wouldn't do. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party are becoming more and more alike, and it's not a good thing. But that being said,
there's no opposition. We don't have an opposition. And the COVID thing, of course, is exactly the same. But Bill Shorten the other night calling them man babies, selfish man babies. I mean, and Sally McManus. How many months ago did she say if there's an unjust law, it can be broken? It should be broken.
It was last year she said that, yeah.
Last year, and now she's criticising her own workforce. It's all over the shop. The whole thing is completely all over the shop.
But the one thing that I am excited for is all these union workers, all these working class people are now looking for a new party, and that opens up the possibilities of the shooter fishers farmers getting up, the LibDems, possibly the United Australia Party, which I don't know if that's a good thing or not.
I don't expect that because these are workers. Given his history, given Clive Palmer's work with the nickel refinery shit show, I don't expect the tradies to back him up on that.
In Melbourne, they'll go LibDems.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, especially with the vocal nature of Limbrick at the moment.
Yeah, he's smashing
Limbrick, and he's on Tim Quilty as well. Tim Quilty was doing some stuff as well. Whereas in New South Wales, they'll probably go, because there are tradies there who are upset as well. They'll probably go SFFP, Shooters, Fishers, Farmers, in New South Wales.
I wouldn't be surprised if Labor vacates a vast majority of their labour force, purely based on the rhetoric coming out of Melbourne right now. The ACTU, I think, is going to see, depending on how the tradies are under the ACTU, I think the tradies are going to exodus them and the CFMEU. I feel like they're going to make their own union. I feel like that's the ultimate culmination of this.
Well, it's already starting. That they are making their own unions. The nurses one, or the not. Is it just nurses? It's
nurses
for
and police.
And police and paramedics. I think
Queensland Police is doing their own union.
Yeah. It's, but with the UAP will probably do really well in Queensland though, because I'm still yet to meet anybody who. See, they know Clive, that's it, but then that could be another discussion. We can talk about personalities all we like. That you've got to put that aside. This is going to be an election like no other. The next one, it's not about. And Trump, you just have to look at Trump for that. It didn't matter that he was base and sharp and gross and all that stuff. It doesn't matter anymore. The people put that aside. The same thing, or this is my opinion, they're going to do the same with Clive Palmer. But of course, it's not just Clive, it's Craig now. So Craig's coming on, so he's going to be the parliamentary leader. So he'll probably do really well in New South Wales as well, and possibly Queensland.
Victoria will definitely be safe LibDems territory. I don't expect SFFP, UAP to make any real inroads in Victoria, given the strong Lib Dem base there already in the state senate with 2 state senators or whatever, the MLC, MPs, whatever they call them in the Victorian state senate.
Before we go into the Lib Dems, do you want to go into the policies of the United Palmer or the United Australia Party, which they've changed names, and then we'll talk about what their policies are? I think probably better, because then we can explain to people where they sit on these sort of policies.
I just hate that they're using the Trump language. Just leave it alone. Just stop. It doesn't help. Like, make Australia great. Stop that.
Yeah, I know.
Well, see, the thing we've got to remember though is it's not really. I learned this reasonably fast. When we're close to it, like we all are clearly, the majority aren't. They don't look at it the same way. We might think that. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate out to the public.
A large portion of the right do support that language. You got a lot, like One Nation voters, Katter Party voters, probably to an extent. You've definitely got right-wing parties or members that would definitely, support UAP's rhetoric there when it comes to using Trump-like language. The problem is that libertarians and the left don't like it. So we're coming from a libertarian perspective. We don't like that language, so we're going to be hostile to it. Whereas more conservative people are going to be more supportive of it to an extent, because we do know that there is a QAnon movement in Australia, for example. It's only small, but
no, there isn't. It's such a crock of shit.
No, there are some that you.
There's like 7.
I think we've got 2 in Western Australia.
You've definitely got some conservatives here who support Trump, less than other countries, but you do have some who will like the UAP's language. It's just a matter of whether or not their language will cause them to lose votes.
Yeah. Well, do you want to talk about the United Australia Party? Because
I guess
they are pro nuclear energy, and I'm all for it.
Well,
I know Gerry's got some thoughts on the UAP as regard to their policies.
Yeah, it's more just we will, but just on that, I'll probably digress, which we can, even though we're libertarians. The Make Australia Great, I'm not convinced that it won't have. I believe that it actually will have appeal, but like everything, we've got to look at it through the lens of the masses, the majority of people out there, not the way that we look at it. Personally, I mean, I don't mind it, but I'm not hung up on all of that sort of thing. It's more about how they present it, and it's timing. This is going to be about timing, exactly like the Trump phenomenon. Yeah. And I really am very keen to watch UAP and how they progress. And as a strategist, if I was part of that campaign, what I would do. So I'm totally fascinated by it.
So it's interesting. I'm just having a look through their policies. It seems very topical, very catchy right now.
Do you want to share that when I put it on screen?
Yeah.
Just for the YouTube viewers, and of course we can read this out for the
Does that work?
Listeners. I've got to add it to the stream. There we go.
There we go.
Can you zoom in a bit? Can you zoom in just to make it more legible?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
So here, right? In lockdowns, great. Domestic vaccine passports, great. This one's interesting.
Yes,
respecting the doctor-patient relationship. That's very interesting.
The language they're using, sanctity, I think is brilliant.
Yeah, so it almost echoes the language of Roe v. Wade in the States, which is medical privacy should be protected, which that's good. This is funny. Abolish the national cabinet.
Gerry and I covered that in the live stream with CD McRae. No, Gerry and I covered that with the live stream with CD McRae about I think we covered it then about the national cabinet and how it's technically not constitutional as far as we can tell. There's always going to be a debate there, but it's not. Yeah, it's basically an evolution of the Council of Australian Governments, but less legally supported. It's more of a. Think of it as a Facebook group chat for the premiers and the prime minister and their offsiders. Yeah.
But so it is unconstitutional because the judge deemed it that way.
And I don't know much about it.
Well, then again, the prime minister is also not in the constitution either, though. So you do have to be careful there.
Abolish the prime minister.
I think it's hilarious. the prime minister is not in the constitution. It's in the Constitution, it's the Governor General on the advice of Parliament. It never mentions the Prime Minister having any authority in the Constitution. It's all from other legislation.
Well, isn't that common law that if it's common law unless in other legislation? Isn't that the whole thing?
I believe the Prime Minister is legislation. Well, no, it would have been developed from the English common law, which is how the English got their Prime Minister.
Right.
Who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer or something like that. Again, the UK Prime Minister, his official title is not Prime Minister. In Australia, it is. I think that was done more through statute than it was common law.
Right. I wanted to bring up this one. Yeah, I wanted to bring up this one. So it talks about the world's largest uranium deposits. We export it, And we also take the waste of the world as well, but we ban it for Australia, which doesn't make sense. I have this argument all the time with people, and it's nuclear energy. Nuclear energy was the bridge between coal and batteries, because batteries are the future, coal is the past. Nuclear energy could have been that 50-year bridge that we needed to develop battery technology, but for some reason the government banned it. I think it was because of the Greens. I think the Greens heavily oppose nuclear, which doesn't make any sense. Like, would they rather have coal than nuclear energy? It doesn't make any sense. We're not on any fault lines, all this stuff. But this is very interesting because I am personally very pro nuclear energy, because you could power the country with such cheap energy. And we're already dumping nuclear waste into a hole in the middle of the desert. So why not use it? It doesn't make any sense for us to keep taking nuclear waste from other people and not use nuclear energy ourselves. We are a country that is 70% unusable land.
Hang on. I thought we didn't allow them to bring their waste here. Is that revoked?
I'm pretty sure that changed a couple of years ago. We're taking everyone's waste. But yeah, so the also research into nuclear technology. That's going to be one of the dumbest deals. Like, once you've sold something to someone, that's their job. Why are we bloody taking the wastage back? Well, I think it used to go to India, and India said no. So for some reason they said yes to us. Don't quote me on this. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I'm pretty sure that we take the world's nuclear waste. But it mentions China, Europe, and the US all have nuclear power, and we should be able to benefit from our own cheap power source, which it only makes sense. Like, I'm very pro nuclear energy personally, but right now I think this is a bad move because it's too late for us to implement nuclear energy. Unless we're looking 40 years down the track, and that's when we will develop battery technology and enough renewable energies to be able to sustain ourselves, I think nuclear energy is the best option for us. But people don't agree.
I do too. My only concern is whether they sustain ourselves in what we're going through at the moment. You know, if it's on the road to a globalist regime, then you just wouldn't know. This
is funny. They completely support the nuclear-powered submarine acquisition.
Well, I'm not surprised. They're definitely right-wing populist.
So that's very interesting. This one's very interesting as well. That is sorely needed. Really, really sorely needed. Protect. So on this one, I hate when people say Australian values, because what are Australian values? Like, Australia is a collaboration of so many different countries, people from different countries. So what are Australian values? Like, that doesn't make sense. What values are we going off? I hate it when this language is used. Personally, I mean, they say protect the rights and freedoms and liberties of every Australian citizen, but do we have them? Not really. So are they going to implement them? Like, it's very vague.
Every single one of those that you're just highlighting now have been breached in the last 12 months.
Yeah. And then that's the last two there.
That last one's quite protectionist. Again, and then you had strengthened the defence force, which is definitely not a libertarian standpoint. And obviously, the biggest thing for me is the UAP's proposal in Queensland by a state MP who was from the UAP back in, I want to say 2013, but around that point in time, where they proposed banning people from owning information that could be used to 3D print firearms, which was passed.
Didn't they just arrest someone for having a plan?
Yeah. Where was that? Was it that? It's illegal in New South Wales.
I'm pretty sure they just arrested and jailed someone for owning plans for 3D printing a firearm.
that was probably New South Wales. It wasn't Queensland because that bill lapsed in Queensland. It was never voted upon. But the fact that Palmer's party did propose a bill to, ban your owning information to 3D print firearms, definitely it sets off warning alarms for me.
Well,
between that and as the anarchist of the group.
Yeah, could you? This is just playing devil's advocate to that. Could you then argue because their gun policy is a lot more lax, isn't it? The UAP.
I don't know
because
there's no mention of it.
Okay,
they have not given us concrete. They haven't given us the gun. They have not given us a gun policy.
No, it doesn't look like it.
Which is why I'm running off of what they've done in practice, because they have not had a consistent gun policy.
Because I was just going to imply though that if they were pro people getting their guns back, then maybe take
the shooter fishers farmers. Yeah, shooter fishers farmers and the LibDems are the only pro gun parties, I think.
Our next three parties we're going to go through, the three we've got left are the three most pro gun parties. So you've got One Nation, LibDems, and SFFP, shooter fishers farmers. One Nation is to an extent. They're not 100% pro gun, and definitely LibDems. It depends who you talk to in the LibDems. The Victorian branch is pretty good. I love the Victorian branch. They're probably my favourite two MPs right now. Is the two Victorian guys, but Campbell Newman, former Queensland Premier, who I would not even give him the time of day. Is libertarian, but also, as I think I said on the podcast with Gerrie and CD McGray, he's basically Campbell Newman stands for, we need to have mandatory minimum sentences for owning illegal guns.
Yeah.
But at the same time, militarizing police. So it depends on who you talk to. Guns in the LibDems, David Leyonhjelm's definitely more pro-gun. The former federal senator. It just depends who you talk to, really.
I feel like if you own illegal guns, you should be given a free license and another gun.
I just want to point out though, that's something we should probably mention, is that being a party that is libertarian, what we want is that, like, from someone in the center, is a bridge between the left and the right. If you want a libertarian party, it means that there's going to be policies that the left have that you want to be able to implement, like decriminalization of drugs for users versus locking them up in prisons. The
rehabilitation over incarceration.
Yeah, the loosening up of laws around drugs. All these sort of things that are typically left-wing policies are coming through, which is what you want to have bridge the gap. So
it's basically solidifying negative rights is pretty much it. Yeah. That's all negative rights.
This is where it's going to be really interesting with Campbell Newman in the LibDems in Queensland. I can't see that is going to work at all. Which
he was not popular. So he created the biggest majority. I think at least for the Liberals, but possibly for any government in Queensland in the election in the early 2010s. He turned that record majority into a one-term government because he was that unpopular as premier. He lost. He was Lord Mayor of Brisbane. Won a seat in that election. Then became premier, and then lost his seat next election. After being the popular Lord Mayor of Brisbane and winning a record majority, and he lost his seat. So having him here is going to do more harm than good.
Well, he doesn't fit the bill. I don't understand how they're going to do it. Even with, I don't know as much about John Ruddick.
He's pretty biased.
John Ruddick he's pretty decent. Centrist and I have both interacted with him. More so centrist.
He's definitely to the right. If there's no denying he's to the right libertarian. Like there's no point in pretending. But he's also from what I've spoken to him, he's very open about the exploration into the left side of policies that fall in line with libertarianism. So you got to remember, reiterate this to people who are watching or listening, is that libertarian and left and right can go hand in hand. You don't have to, it's not one or the other. This is something that you can work. I think it's probably a good example of where you can work with both sides. And I think that's something we need going forward.
Libertarian parties tend to, in theory at least, especially in America, tend to be right-wing on economic policies and left-wing on social policies. Unless you want to talk about the Hoppians, who are social conservatives and economic conservatives. But generally, libertarian parties tend to be economic right, social
they don't
left.
exist. No, you're right though. It's a very, and this is the problem. You need a party, especially a libertarian party. You need a wide variety of libertarians that span the spectrum.
Yeah, for it to
because
work.
then you can get massive input from multiple different points of view, as opposed to just getting the ANCAP point of view, for example, which is more guns and free market.
Well, it's not really like ANCAPs aren't a big force in Australia. It is mostly classical liberals with a few minarchists. ANCAP is very small.
Classical liberals should be calling themselves libertarians.
Oh,
they're not.
I totally agree. Classical liberalism is rooted in all of that John Stuart Mill, John Locke, the Hobson stuff, the whole free thinking, stay out of my life, let me live my life, private property ownership. They didn't like collectivism, but they always did talk about a safety net. But then that's focused on communities. And I know from the ancient world, because I'm a Roman historian, but from the ancient world, it was all very much then based on communities that then, of course, worked to help themselves, and people contributed to, needed roads or fencing, not that they had roads really back then.
Yeah.
But if we're doing it and layering it over to the modern world, I am seeing a movement back to that, which is really, that's community, that's real community, as opposed to collectivism, which I am absolutely opposed to.
It's voluntarism is what it is. That's what we need to move towards.
Yeah, that's right.
To me, it's a spectrum. Libertarianism is a spectrum. One end is classical liberals, the other end is anarchists, and you move along that spectrum depending on where you sit. But I'm definitely more of a big tent approach, definitely more lib unity kind of person. So to me, I don't like gatekeeping. So to me, classical liberals are on the spectrum of being libertarian. To other people, they aren't, like yourself, Jack, and to some people, anarchists are not libertarian either. It just depends on your perspective on the spectrum.
Yeah. I think the Liberal Democrats they go too far to win people over. So I actually had a look at the Liberal Democrats policies a while ago, and it's like abolish all public health care, and I'm like, that's not a winning platform.
What,
right? You can't. Yeah,
that's not on their website.
It was a lot. It was when I looked.
Well, it's not on there at the moment. I don't know. I haven't seen that.
They've changed their website a lot actually since the last time. But that was on their website. This was back when David Leyonhjelm was in the Senate.
Well, that's definitely not what they're running on at the moment.
Well, that's years out of date then.
Yeah. But that's sort of, so maybe they've tamed it down a little bit. But that's if I was running as a part of Liberal Democrats, I would propose an opt-in, opt-out tax system with the full benefits of the welfare state, but you don't get it if you don't pay. So I feel like that's a decent idea that could be used, where it's like, if you want the benefits of the welfare state that's already been set up, then it's opt-in, opt-out.
So far we've gone through what they stand for in practice. I want to quickly run through what they stand for in theory before we move on to the last two parties. So I'll just pull up the list of their policies right now. Wait for it to load. There we go. So their policy list definitely seems to be more libertarian. So you've got free markets and freedom of choice, free trade in goods, services, capital, small government, low taxation, limited government spending and regulation, widespread ownership of private property, civil society and volunteerism, which is volunteerism basically, civil liberties and individual freedom, individual liberty, and this is the part I really like about it: personal responsibility under the rule of law. Because during COVID right now, almost every other party has had the stance of, it's your job to make other people be safe, and it's your job because it's a civil duty. So it's your duty to make other people safe. So it's more of a collective mindset. Whereas under the Liberal Democrats, it's your job to make sure that you are safe, and you must be. And it's a lot more individualist than collectivist.
Well, yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell people for the last 18 months. I'm like, if you make sure that you aren't sick and everyone else makes sure that they aren't sick, then we'll all be fine. But you guys are more worried about me than you are about yourself.
Yeah, that's it.
And that's the problem.
And one of the key things here for me that sets them apart from the UAP is they want decentralized government and competitive federalism, as opposed to the UAP, which just started a petition to abolish state government, which could seem good on paper, but that's going to centralize power in the federal government.
Yeah.
Having state, federal, and local means you have, as the LibDems call it, competitive federalism. It means you have that split there where you do have power more localized to an extent. If you get rid of the state government, you give most of that power is going to go to the federal government, which just means you're concentrating all the power in the hands of just a few people. Having states there is at least, even though it's often ineffective, it is at least another level of protection there for rights, especially if the states and federal government disagree. It means they can be a check to one another, in theory at least. So I definitely think that's more of a libertarian stance than what the UAP's got on states existing.
Yeah. I think the other... Sorry, go on.
And I suppose it depends on if they bring that caveat in. Well, it's not a caveat. They said they want to replace it with regional government, but they haven't spelled that out, and it's not on their website either, of course. So you're right, Liberty. That is far more in the tent of libertarian ideas.
I mean, ideally, I'd like to see, again, ideally for an anarchist, if we have to have a state, I'd like to see each of those 151 federal electorates become their own sort of state. It'd be a big logistics change, but ideally, I want to see as many smaller political entities as possible. Really break down government and its size, and really give authority to different levels of government, so you have that more accountability, more checks and balances, at least in theory.
Well, I think that's the idea behind regional government. Well, it was at least when we were discussing it when I worked at the newspaper. That's how we looked at it, because there's a map that apparently it exists or has been drawn to for the 51 states or provinces or whatever you want to call it. Now, and then I suppose then you have to change the electorates. But again, decentralisation was the only, you have to do that. It would rely on heavy decentralisation.
I think you've got one point to cover for the LibDems, then we'll move on. Centrist wants to go over the 5-point plan of WA.
Yeah, so basically what I wanted to point out is what those policies that we just went through on the LibDem side of things look like at a more interactive model as opposed to blanket statements. So if you read the policies they want to bring in regarding jobs, one of the big one is by eliminating the payroll tax for small businesses. So what this does is allows smaller businesses to be able to employ more people and therefore create better wages for those people as well. It stops that pressure on businesses going from 1 or 2 person organisations to be able to grow to a 3 or 4. So it's something that's really, I think, a really good policy, especially in a country where we have a lot of small businesses. We basically run off small business. Well, we did until COVID. Yeah, so and then you look other policies by removing the taxes on things like stamp duty, which makes housing more affordable. You don't have to pay the stamp duty when you sell your house. all these sort of things. So if you go down a bit further as well, and this obviously is West Australian focused, it'll be different for each state, but at least you can see what the principles of the core of the group are and how that can relate to you in your specific state. So the COVID response is very similar to the UAP. It's basically scrap lockdowns, scrap overreach of the government with all this passport talk, but also basically, again, put the responsibility back on the person with their own health rather than the collective being responsible for everyone else's health. And if you scroll down again, this probably doesn't relate so much to you guys over the east, because what we have here in WA, which is probably a good thing to point out, is that we still have state-run services. So our water is only by one company, our power is basically one company, and our gas is basically, like, I think there's maybe one or two, but the government's really happy.
That's gross.
Whose mic is that? Is it yours?
I think that's Jack's. Anyway,
what's happening? What's happening?
Is that your mic?
Your mic.
I think
doing what?
His mic is crackling. What's crackling?
It won't be mine.
Oh, I'll try again. Yeah, so basically, in order to strip back government interference, it would then reduce how much extra we pay. Because, as a personal example, we used less water than we did this time last year and less water than we did last month, but our bill still rose because our costs, our taxes that go towards supplying the water continue to grow. So this is where they want to strip that back and make cost of living a lot more affordable. Same as electricity and other statewide policies that they bring in. And then if you go down again, I think there's another point.
So that's your computer. Yep. That's more your community focus with yes. Like school vouchers. School vouchers is, I think, more of a American thing that they're co-opting for Australia, as far as I know.
Yeah. So what I want to.
I think I've lost it. Hang on. It's just
basically while you find it.
There we go.
There we go. Cool. So basically, what I would. The reason why I wanted to go through these sort of policies and that people can have a look at this is a lot of people will actually agree with a heap of what the Liberal Democrats are proposing, but they won't know, because people will say that the Liberal Democrats are right-wing or crazy, minority party, when really, because no one goes and reads the policies of the groups, really. No one, they're all apathetic. So when you realise that you actually probably hold a lot of these values, like back to basics policing and getting police back at the community level, is something that a lot of people when you're involved in the small communities like where I am and in other communities, a lot of people want this. They don't want the big overreach like we're seeing in Melbourne, what's going on now. We want that local cop that used to come around and knew the kids by name, didn't go and beat the crap out of them, like back to when the policing and the community got along a lot better. Because I know a lot of you guys get rid of the cops altogether, but at the same point, that's not what's going to get you. I know Jack's thumbs up. That's not what's going to get you over the line in an electorate. So, and this focus on getting the cops back to the grassroots, I think it's a really good push. But again, you're not. A lot of people won't know this when they go to the voting booth.
I mean, that involves a lot of demilitarization as well,
which is good.
Yeah,
that's what we want.
Yeah.
So,
do you want 0.5 up now?
Yeah, we can do. I don't think I've.
It's just more accountability.
The best one. Freeze politician and public sector wage increases until the state budget is balanced. So that's for the state level. This is something that the LibDems fed, I believe, follow the same principles.
Yes.
At the moment, politicians earn way too much money. We want to talk about bringing back money into the budget and stuff. Politician pay cuts is something that we should really be looking at. I believe a Senate, I think we talked about it earlier, that a senator first time in a seat earns over $200,000 a year. That's insane to me. I don't like for someone who could be completely inexperienced, never had done it, and earn $200,000 a year to be in a position. That's a lot of money. So it's sickening to see when you think the likes of Dan Andrews of that are on over 400K a year. But it's just, I don't know. That's something we can look at holding the government to account for. So.
Just one more point before we move on to the final two parties. So as I was saying, those seem pretty common sense, but because of the fact that the LNP is at least in theory centre right, it means that the Australian newspaper, which is one of the biggest national newspapers, has called the LibDems hard right. So
which is fucking not.
Which means I'm far right as an anarchist. So, but that's the point. Like, because the media will portray, because everything in Australia except for One Nation and the UAP is shifted to the left compared to, say, the USA. Because of that shift to the left, it means that classical liberal parties like the LibDems and probably to a lesser extent, Students, Fishers, and Farmers Party are seen as, being, as the Australians said, hard right. So I think that's probably one of the biggest obstacles in Australia right now for libertarian-minded people is how people see the Lib Dems and the SFFP. They see them as being more radical.
It's one of the
worst.
So
if they see the Lib Dems as hard right, why don't they see fascists as?
Well, that's what I said. Like, I'm far right. I'm a fascist. I'm a fascist who wants no government whatsoever. Apparently, it's a thing. And the worst thing is that there are people out there who do believe that anarchists are fascists, which I just don't,
which doesn't make any sense.
I want a dictatorship with no government.
That's right. It's just insane. This is where the whole left-right paradigm, anyway, as far as I'm concerned, it's dead. And the left, I think we should start really getting rid of that whole talk of left and right, because, well, particularly now where it's tyranny versus freedom.
Yeah.
That's
it's a top-bottom fight.
Absolutely. Yep.
People need to ditch the left-right and start focusing top-bottom.
Yeah, but the problem is you can't.
At the very least,
sorry.
At the very least, use the quadrant system that we use and that Centrist uses as his profile picture. Use that quadrant system at the very least.
At least, yeah. Because at the moment, anything that's not establishment left is considered far right. It's become a joke. And the problem is you have to talk left and right with people because otherwise...
Because it's the common understanding.
Yeah, but 9 times out of 10, half the policies they're talking about are actually a top-bottom. So vaccine mandates have nothing to do with the left and the right. So anyone that says far right policy, it's ridiculous.
And far right policy is open market, unfettered open market. That's far right.
Yeah, exactly. So
vaccine mandates are about left and right, which is economics, only to the extent that it's forcing businesses to only serve customers that have the vaccine and only employ people who have the vaccine. That's the only way in which the vaccine mandate is about economics. It's mostly about political control, which is where podcasters like us come in trying to break down that paradigm in Australian politics.
And it needs to happen here more than anywhere else, I reckon.
We've got about 15 minutes to go. I just want to wrap up and do the One Nation and SFFP if no one's got any more points on LibDems.
We'll do One Nation just in case we run out of time because they're probably the next biggest.
I feel like Students, Fishers, Farmers is more interesting.
Yeah,
most people don't know them though. One Nation, as some centrists said, is just everyone knows it, but because the shooters and fishers, they're in New South Wales.
South Wales, and they're in regional Victoria as well.
Yeah, they're in Western Australia as well.
No.
They're not really a force in Queensland or in the two central.
Which doesn't make sense because a lot of people in Queensland hunt and fish. So it doesn't make sense why it wouldn't be a party.
SFFP.
No, it's SFFP hasn't had success because Katter Party feels that niche in Queensland. And then Shooter Fish Farmers don't have any influence in South Australia because South Australia that's where the Central Alliance comes in. And then in Northern Territory, it's all Labor. So that central strip is SFFP has no hold. Same in Queensland. It's WA, New South Wales, Victoria, and that's it. ACT they're not present because ACT is basically a state of bureaucrats or territory of bureaucrats, and then Tasmania, they're not relevant down there. Tasmania is just Liberals, Labor, and Greens, as far as I know.
So,
but anyway, yes, One Nation.
Yeah, One Nation. I noticed on their website they've the very first thing that comes up, next to their logo is "Say No to Vaccine Passports." So they've made that front and centre. Even that it's separate to our policies.
Probably a lot of Americans and foreigners would know One Nation through Pauline Hanson, the red-headed lady who at one point wore a burqa into Senate, which is a senator, to protest against Muslims being allowed to wear burqas and say, you can't see my face, you don't know if I'm actually me, therefore let the ban burqas. So she used to be anti-Asian in the 1990s. Then was she arrested or what happened there? Did she go to prison?
She got arrested. Yeah, she did go to prison for a little bit.
She went to prison and then came out. And now she's anti-Muslim. Although I did hear that her parents' fish and chip shop, where she used to work, is now owned by Asians, which is interesting.
That's funny.
A bit of irony there for you.
It is funny because you're showing your age at the moment. I think the reason why Pauline Hanson is actually famous is because Pauline Pantsdown did a parody song called "Please Explain," and it was on Rage and everywhere, all over the world. It was parodies before parodies were big. So
she is notorious for One Nation is basically more personality centered. So Mark Latham, who used to be Labor leader, was he Labor leader federally under Howard? Was he Labor leader then, or when was he?
Yeah, he was the Labor leader. He's going up against Howard.
He used to be the opposition leader under which is the leader of the least powerful of the two major parties in the lower house under John Howard, and then he left Labor, became One Nation. Stuart Rock, who's the other guy? The other guy who's big on Facebook. There's two One Nation guys that are big on Facebook. There's
Malcolm Roberts.
Malcolm Roberts. I was thinking Stuart Roberts, who's LNP. Malcolm Roberts and Mark Latham, probably the two biggest one. Mark Latham is the leader of New South Wales One Nation. But the thing is that Pauline Hanson is notorious for eating her 2IC. She'll always, fight with a deputy and then kick them out of the party. So there's a lot more infighting in One Nation than any other party, even the Liberals, who've had plenty of infighting in the last 5 or 6 years. They're a lot more. They're pro-gun, which is good, but they're anti-freedom of expression, anti-freedom of speech, as seen with the burqa ban, and they're very much protectionist and pro-war. Probably they're more associated with Trump than the UAP are. And I'd even say they're more pro-Trump than Scott Morrison supposedly is. Sarcastic. Scott Morrison, for some reason, is seen as being Australia's Trump, but Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party is definitely.
No.
Except everyone hates him.
I don't get it, but the left see Scott Morrison as being our version of Trump because they had a few phone calls. I know, but yeah, One Nation is
laughable thing. Anyway, One
Nation is definitely seen as being more American popular style conservative. They're probably before COVID they were the most authoritarian right-wing party, except maybe Katter, but that's debatable. But definitely One Nation is probably the most right-wing authoritarian party until now, when they're anti-vaccine mandate and anti-lockdown and anti-mask mandate and Liberals and Labor are pro-mandate. So it's really a flip over the policies there right now, which is interesting. But of course, if one nation gets more power, they could flip. Who knows? That they are known to be quite populist and quite.
They didn't do very well in the last election. They haven't moved their numbers.
No, they really dragged in the ass.
They were big when Paul and Hinton came back on the scene. So early 2010s, they got a few seats, but they have the last two federal elections. They have dropped significantly. Was it 10% or something? They dropped by like 10% at one point. Was it last election? Was the massive drop by like 10%?
I don't know if it was 10, but it might have been 8. It was, yes, Rees was significant enough, and the Greens just didn't move.
All right, that election was definitely a more liberal Labor fight. It was the LNP. It was Labor's election to lose, and they lost. What can you say? It is really surprising to see the. Well, I say surprising. It's really, it's not surprising at all. But it is interesting to see Australia become so devoted to those two parties. Labor being around since the late 1800s, whereas the right has always been more divisive, always having splinter factions that then become the main right party. But now we are really seeing that focus on just Labor and Liberals in almost every state. As I said before, Tasmania is basically just a Labor versus Liberals fight right now. I think 25 seats in the lower house, 13 of them are Liberals, so a 1-seat majority, and then Labor and Greens are the other 12. It is really become Labor and Liberal, and to an extent, Greens.
Well, we have to bear in mind
minor parties had a lot less influence at the last election than they had in the past.
Well, this one is going to be interesting because we've got, I think there's around 50 marginal seats. That is, I think it was, I can't remember, I would say a good decade ago, there were only 15 marginal seats. So in that time, in a decade, approximately, there's been a shift. That's how fragmented we are, which is why the presence of the LibDems now with, more high-profile people going over to them in UAP are going to, it's just going to be so interesting. So that begs the question of the single-issue parties. They're not going to get anywhere in this election, the single-issue parties. And even banding together, and that's a separate talk, I guess. I don't know if that's even going to help because all eyes on, when you get a new party, get 50,000 members, something's going on because people don't generally join political parties. Before COVID, Australians didn't join political parties. They were actually bleeding members.
Yep. And also there is talk about LibDems, United Party, and I can't think of the third one now. Sorry. It's working together at the next election in terms of preferences in order to ensure that the Liberal Labor has less of a say, hopefully, in the election.
Oh, they should, centrists. So I would like to think they would be working together, and they'll campaign separately, but they should, because Labor and Liberal, it has to be broken, the hold, and that's the only way I like to see them do it.
Yeah, I think my favourite meme that's going around at the moment is the car meme when you're coming off the freeway and it's got straight or turn, and it's basically vote Liberal, Labor, or vote anyone else, and the car's heading anywhere else. So I think there's a lot of that sentiment going out at the moment, which I'm excited for, because if we're gonna see a way out of the dichotomy and the corruption, to be honest, I think there's too much corruption going on in our politics as well. It's become really, really dirty, and I think for us to see, we need to see change in order to make the mainstream politicians start realising that they're losing popularity, I suppose is the way to put it.
You're right about One Nation, Gerrie. It was the last state election for Queensland. It was a swing of, it wasn't 10%. It was 6.6% was a swing against a One Nation.
Yeah,
So, which is still compared to the last election. The last election they had a massive swing towards them. I think they got 12% in the 2014 election. I think it was 12% of the vote, and then it was like 7%. No, 2017 election. It was 2017 was that swing towards them of up to 12%. I think was their end vote turnout, and then it was it's now back into 7%. They lost like half their vote, so they are losing popularity. It just depends as to how that plays out in the next election.
I think that the people look at them parties and see not just what they're campaigning on, but can they govern? Are they capable of governing? And that's where the UAP and the LibDems will have it all over them, and especially if they work in some kind of, like not a coalition, they won't do that, but maybe, I don't know, maybe they might do.
Can you imagine?
They run in seats, maybe not have the three-cornered contest or something. I don't know.
Anyway, do you want to quickly cover the SFFP? Before we finish up? This would be obviously mostly Jack and Centrist. You guys would have the most to do with SFP, I'd imagine. SFFP, Shooter Fishers Farmers. I don't know much about them because they're not a force in Queensland.
I'll find policies.
Yeah,
do you know much about them, Centrist?
I know a little bit about them. I looked them up when I was looking up the LibDems because I actually know a guy who ran for Senate in WA here under the Shooter Fishers party. I think they're down the libertarian path as well. And it's only going from a very little knowledge that I have of it. When Jack gets the policies up, we'll have a better idea because they're definitely not a mainstream party.
Fun story.
I think, as far as I know, I'm pretty sure they're basically what is it? Green conservative. I'm pretty sure. Because they're conservative, but they're also environmentalist. If I remember correctly, they've got 6 state MPs across WA, New South Wales, and Victoria. They've got 6 state MPs. I think they're all in the state senates, but still, they are. Okay, they're definitely more of a force than LibDems are because they're a bit more conservative. So they've got that more appeal there. Plus, they're pro farming and pro environmentalism as well. So they get the bit of a Greens Labor vote as preferencing.
So it says here, so they only do their policies in PDS, which is annoying. So this is their freedom, liberty, and privacy federal policies. Just a rundown of what they believe. Founded on the basic belief all citizens are born free, should remain free, and freedom is an inherent right of all Australians. Fantastic.
That's actually a good one. I like that.
I really like the Shooter Fishers Farmers. They're very low key, but they're very powerful in their messaging. They're extremely pro-gun, if I remember correctly. So here, all citizens should be able to live privately, not fearing the encroachment of government or its agencies, their unnecessary intrusion at the behest of minority groups bent on control. Privacy is of the utmost importance. Without individual privacy, there can be no freedom of thought, no freedom of speech, and ultimately no democratic rights at all. I really like that. That's good.
Yeah, I agree.
Their plan, write and implement an Australian Bill of Human Rights that will protect the legal rights of Australian citizens and residents. Protect these rights in inalienable and actionable. These rights be inalienable and actionable by citizens in Australia to protect those rights. So basically enshrining self-defense. Implement freedom of the press, media, and social media legislation regardless of platform. That will grant protection to the fourth estate. I like that. Guaranteeing commercial independence for freedom of expression. The party will give preference of media freedom of private... Sorry, did I read that wrong? The party will give preference of media freedom to private enterprise in any market ahead of government-controlled entities or channels, basically putting private news agencies above the ABC and the SBS, unlike now when the ABC and the SBS get preferential treatment. The reach of government-owned media outlets must be limited, and where available or where already existing must have a balanced voice. So basically eliminating the heavy left-wing bias of the SBS and the ABC, which fair because it's publicly funded, but not so much because it's kind of hypocritical to this part here. But it is state-run, so it's kind of not private. So, yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. Promote privacy legislation that defines ownership of personal data and information, its use, dissemination, scrutiny, and ultimately its removal at the behest of citizen or group of citizens affected. I like that. That is fantastic.
Just one final point on the SFFP to play devil's advocate here is that they when it comes to water, they want water all controlled by environmental water, all controlled by one entity. So they want a monopoly on water basically, and they don't want water being a commodity. Water is not to be sold or swapped or bought by people. So
it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, but I'm just pointing out
who owns water, but that also goes into land ownership. Who owns land? So I see where you're coming from, but I think as a country we could probably agree that water should be equally shared between us. That's probably a good idea, especially. But yeah, I don't know. This one is foreign affairs. One, increase investment. Oh, okay. Interesting. Increase investment in defense and rebuild domestic skill base in defense industries. So basically keep making stuff here. Commit to working with government of the day to plan and implement real solutions to mitigate negative effects of highly concentrated populations. Immediate review of the impact of immigration. Impact funding for homeless and drug addiction research. Innovation means reducing homelessness in Australia. Reject any international agreement, treaty, protocol unless such agreement is previously approved by the National Federal Parliament. Governments are not to sign up to any treaties or United Nations undertaking without the prior approval of Federal Parliament, like that. Support increased funding for telecommunication services specifically aimed at rural and regional access. That's good. That screams Starlink. That's what that screams Starlink.
Anyway, we have hit the hour 30 mark. I think we might wrap it up here. Yeah. We've covered Liberals, Labor, Greens, UAP, One Nation, LibDems, and SFFP. I think that's all the major parties covered. So I think with regards to upcoming shows...
they oppose a firearms registry. That's funny.
with regards to upcoming shows, we've got 2 live streams this weekend. We've got the live stream with me and a few Brits on Sunday, our time at 8 a.m. And then at 10 a.m. our time, which is 8 p.m. US East Coast time, daylight saving time, is myself, returning guest from the first ALN live stream, Harry Test Libertarian, another guy from America as well, and a few of us talking about Christianity and libertarianism and how those two intersect. And we should have an episode from the Australian Economics podcast coming out sometime this week as well, hopefully. They're episode number 2.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else I've missed?
No.
That's good.
People should look up my podcast.
Yes. I'll put your podcast.
Yeah, plug my shit.
in the description. Yeah. We've still got to work out how that fits in with this podcast.
Yeah, we gotta somehow figure out how it's going to fit into the network, if you want to say. But we'll see.
Anyway, until next time.
That was very good.
It was.
Okay.
Did that stop? I don't think that stopped recording. It's still recording.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
All right, no worries.